Welcome in, my killer friends. I hope everyone is having a fantastic day. Today we're going to be looking at the 5 worst killers for new players to use. Now, before we get started, it's important to know that just because a killer is on this list doesn't mean you outright shouldn't use this killer. This list is mostly composed of killers that may be hard to use at first and could discourage new players from liking the game. But by all means, if one of these killers looks interesting to you, please pick them up and have a fun time with it. That's really all that matters while you're playing Dead by Daylight. And as always, guys, please come check us out on Twitch, Fallen9579_TV. We are constantly playing killer over there, and I would love to help out a few new players if they need the help. But anyways, guys, with all of that out of the way, let's go ahead and get into the first killer that new players should avoid. And coming in at the number 1 spot with absolutely no surprise whatsoever, we have the Nurse. The Nurse easily has one of the most difficult powers to control in the entire game, and the blinks can be a nightmare to understand. The Nurse's entire kit is based around understanding how survivors move, making it almost impossible for new players to take advantage of her power. For new players just hopping into the game, you should know that survivors move at a base speed of 4.0 meters per second. And in general, with some exceptions, most killers move at 4.6 meters per second. Keeping all of this in mind, we should note that the Nurse moves at a sluggish 3.85 meters per second, making her 0.15 meters per second slower than survivors. Though all of this may sound really confusing, basically all you need to know is she is the slowest killer in the game with the hardest ability to use, making her a nightmare for brand new players to pick up. So in general, this may be one of the killers you want to wait on until you have a few more hours in the game. Coming right up next into our number 2 slot is the Huntress. Though the Huntress may seem like a pretty straightforward killer, don't be fooled. The Huntress has a slow base movement speed of 4.4 meters per second, but it gets worse. While carrying a hatchet, the Huntress has a 3.68 meters per second movement speed, making her even slower than the Nurse. On top of all this, you have to learn how to throw hatchets and the hitboxes that surround those hatchets, not to mention the hitboxes that surround the environment. While the Huntress may be able to keep up in the beginning, she will become increasingly harder to play, especially as survivors climb the ranks with you. Once players have a strong understanding of the game and survivors, the Huntress can be an absolute monster of a killer, but until that point, it may be wise to avoid her. Coming into our number 3 spot, we have none other than the Hillbilly. The Hillbilly as a killer does not really have any big downsides. The main downfall that many new players will have is trying to get a hold of his chainsaw. While charging the chainsaw, the Hillbilly's movement speed also slows down to a 3.68 meters per second movement speed. And once the Hillbilly begins a chainsaw sprint, he will move at 9.2 meters per second, which is insanely fast. Overall, the Hillbilly is pretty comparable to most of the killers in the game. New players may just struggle a lot with this chainsaw as it is very hard to control. Climbing on down to slot number 4, guys, we have the Plague. So let's go over some of the basics of the Plague. The Plague has a base movement speed of 4.6 meters per second. Her Vile Purge is used to infect healthy survivors and inflict the broken status effect on them, meaning that survivors will go down in one hit. The only way to cure this broken status effect is to cleanse out a pool of devotion. But while cleansing may cure you of your broken status effect, it then gives the Plague the option to ingest Corrupt Purge. Corrupt Purge acts the same as Vile Purge mechanically, but instead of causing survivors to become sick, it will deal health stakes to them, making it very easy for the Plague to down survivors quickly. From the surface, the Plague honestly may not seem too complicated and pretty easy to play in general. The problem is that the Plague's power can be much harder to use than many new players understand. Firstly, her Vile and Corrupt Purge can be extremely difficult to use without practice. Secondly, the Plague has to do tons of multitasking, infecting generators and survivors, knowing when to fully infect and chase different survivors, and knowing when to ingest Corrupt Purge. Third and lastly, the Plague seems deceptively easy to use, making the game very frustrating for newer players. Overall, the Plague can be one of the most oppressive killers in the game, but it does require a lot of in-depth understanding about Dead by Daylight. So overall, I would just suggest some new players get a little bit more comfortable with Dead by Daylight before picking the Plague up. Coming in at number 5 and our last spot for the day is the Nemesis. The Nemesis is the newest installment in Dead by Daylight and honestly would have been bringing a lot of players into this game. The Nemesis overall is a pretty solid killer, but I do think there are a few key reasons new players should avoid him. The Nemesis moves at a speed of 4.6 meters per second and his power is the T-Virus. The Nemesis can use his whip to infect healthy survivors, making chases much shorter in the future. Survivors can rid themselves of this virus by finding vaccinations in highlighted cases around the map. map. But getting back on track, the real reason I think people should avoid Nemesis is because of his power. Many players, including myself, are still very confused on how the hit detection works with the Nemesis's whip, making it difficult for everyone to understand his power. On top of this, to fully infect a survivor and down them, Nemesis will have to go through a 3-hit chase, which can be very difficult for brand new players. Overall, I think the Nemesis is a pretty solid killer in Dead by Daylight and definitely a fun one to play, but I do think he can be very frustrating at certain points. So for new players just hopping into the game, you might want to wait just a little bit on Nemesis. Anyways guys, that's all I have for you today. Thank you so much for sticking around and watching. If you guys did enjoy the video, please make sure to like and subscribe. But I hope everyone just has a fantastic day, and I will catch you guys in the next one.